Okay, welcome to Senate Education. It is Friday, April 15th, 1:40. Apologize for a bit of a late start here. I think we're going to try to work until about 3:30, recognizing that a number of colleagues throughout the building have different holiday commitments. So with that, we're looking at H716, a new draft. Ms. St. James, would you mind joining us at the table? So this is the House's miscellaneous education bill. And
yes, sorry.
please, no problem.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is draft 3.1 of H716, which, as Chair Campion just said, is the House's miscellaneous bill. The highlighted sections are the yellow highlighting are the only changes from yesterday. This is draft 3.1. Yesterday you had 2.1. The green highlighting is meant to just flag that that's a policy decision or a decision point that needs to be made in section 2 there on page 2.
Right, thank you very much.
So the new language is on the first spot with new language is on page 2, section 3, line 17 through 18. This is to reflect the committee's discussion yesterday about adding a directive that in addition to Holocaust education, there should be some requirement to include education on, and the term I used is historical global human rights violations.
Cool. Nice.
So, just a question as to wouldn't we want to include current human rights violations as well?
Well, it could say Holocaust education.
Just take out the word historical.
Just take out the
Yeah.
word historical.
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah, Senator.
My only concern is
Yeah.
that the human rights violation can be a pretty small thing, and the Holocaust is pretty drastic, huge thing. So
That's a really good point.
I just worry that people would see that we're not emphasizing the severity of the Holocaust and say like,
Could split it out into separate. I think yesterday there was discussion about splitting it out, and
So maybe split it out, Holocaust education and
so you have ABC. Holocaust education would be A, B would be global human rights violations, and C would be civics education.
or maybe if
Actually,
we didn't
that's
say
good.
other, because then they're saying it's one of the human rights. I mean, it was a human rights violation, but it was a mass murder, so it's like much more than that. So maybe if we just said Holocaust education and educated related to human rights violations, then we're not saying the Holocaust is human rights violation. You know what I mean?
so you're thinking, Holocaust education and you're adding the word other?
No, taking other out. Because if you said
I see other,
it makes
okay.
it seem like
Yes.
that's one of the human rights
Holocaust
violations.
education,
other than
education,
Oh, related to global human rights violations, like that?
And education of historical global human rights violations.
so and maybe get rid of the historical, Senator Lyons for so Holocaust education and education of global human rights violations.
Related to. If you want related to-
Education.
Kind of begs the
Education
question.
of related, no, take out related
What about
to.
And education of global human rights.
So it would be Holocaust education and education of global
human rights
human
violations?
rights violations?
Okay,
I mean, does that say?
we can always keep wordsmithing, but for now, I think that's a good spot. And then there's another piece of green on page 3.
Yep, so that's now yellow. It should be yellow.
Okay.
The new draft that I sent Daphne. This section, page 3, section 4 was the section regarding to updating the education quality standards rules that needs to happen for your section 3 to actually be effective. Yesterday there was some discussion from AOE about whether it should be the State Board of Education or the Agency of Education making, doing the rulemaking. And it sounds like there was perhaps some misunderstanding related to the original information supplied by AOE to the committee and the attorney who was working on this language as it appears in 287. And my understanding from AOE's testimony yesterday, as well as information I have since received, is that the only update that needed to be made to this section was simply replacing Board of Education with Agency of Education on line 6. So it is the Agency of Education that shall initiate rulemaking. And then prior to the filing of the draft updated rules with ICAR, AOE shall engage stakeholders for input on the draft rules in accordance with a written plan approved by the State Board of Education. I believe that mirrors what the State Board of Education and AOE are proposing in their new their new roles, the report that came before you in their new roles. So that's it. And then only other change was to the effective date section, which is on page 6. As we discussed yesterday, section 3, which is updating the education quality standards, requires some rulemaking. So before that can go into effect, the rulemaking needs to happen. So the effective date section reads, this act shall take effect on July 1, 2022, except that section 4, which is the rulemaking section, shall take effect. Oh, no, it's the other way around. Sorry, that should be section 3. Except that section 3 shall take effect on July 1, 2024. Sorry about that. I was quick drafting before I ran down here, and I will fix that.
So committee, I would say this and 727 will likely be probably the last things to leave this room. One of the things I'm waiting, one of the reasons with 716 is I'm waiting to see if the House acts on S219. There's been back and forth. There's no, we're not going to. Earlier today, they made a statement that they're not going to. That changed after a conversation that they are considering it. There is, as we heard from the ACLU, that one piece, the anti-discrimination piece, that could end up on this. And so last I spoke with the corner office with Chief of Staff Carolyn Wesley. She's pulling together a conversation with leadership in House and Senate Ed chairs next week. So, and we also have a couple of others to decide on this, but we're getting to, I think, a good spot. And I think 727 will take next week, but I want this in good shape early next week, and then we would just add that amendment if need be. And as we know, H517 is probably ready to vote. I talked about voting it today, but I need to read it again over the weekend. That's military.
Oh, yeah.
And then we've got 456, which I think will be better on next week. Any questions about this right now as it relates to our work?
When we vote it out, do you mind if I report on it?
No, that would be great. That would be terrific.
Actually, no, it was H456.
That's the bill related to state colleges. That could be
The goals. Yeah.
the goals. If you do have an amendment, yeah, we should just talk. It really belongs in Jeanette White's committee, but we can, that might make the most sense. Okay. Anything else? Yes, Senator Perkins.
I don't want to talk to the council about a possible amendment.
Already noted.
And whatever he asked for. Just,
It could include a member of faculty on the board and sports betting. We could combine both amendments in one.
Okay, thank you so much. So can you stay around? Okay. Put yourself in those chairs. You started this, Ms. Mr. Fisher.
That's why Mr. Fisher.
Right, he's right.
That's why he's on the screen.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Olson, you're first up. Good to see you. We haven't seen you, I think, since our discussions around 219 and other bills earlier this session. H716, eager to hear the state board's thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Senator Campion, for the patient.
We're having a hard time
You need to
hearing you.
move over.
Turn his video off. No, he's really.
Okay, I'll try to move. Can you hear me now?
Yes, but you might want to turn the video off. That might help with the audio.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Record, Oliver Olson, Chair of the State Board of Education. I was asked to testify on an earlier draft of this bill, and I apologize. I've only had a few minutes to review the most current draft. So I believe you were looking for testimony on section 2, which pertained to the delay of the 2360 rule series. And also I note that there are some other areas of the bill involving the state board. So if I'm reading section 2 correctly on the new bill, it appears that if, you're removing the delay that the House had proposed. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, what we have, Ledge Council has done a great job of, we are still needing to decide. So we'll either delay the rule, do a middle ground kind of thing, which is a waiver process, or yes, or actually have no delay at all. So we are still deciding between those three.
Okay. So, so my previous testimony on this issue, the board had some discussion early in the year, and the board's position was that there should be no delay to any of the Act 173 related rules. So that is the position of the board, although I recognize that this does present some challenges in certain parts of the state. So I do want to acknowledge that there are those challenges out there. But the position of the board, the last time we discussed this as a full board, was that there should be no delay to any rule implementation coming out of Act 3. With respect to sections 3 and 4, I did want to highlight, looking at in section 4, the date of February 1st, 2023. The agent comment on as the latest draft, which I just received, directs the agency to initiate that rulemaking. If it was the board initiating that rulemaking, I would have, because a lot of the work and stakeholders occurs before that pre-filing, and that looked a little aggressive to me, but I'll let the agency comment on that now that they're. Yes.
We're having a really hard time hearing you. You're just in and out. And last we heard was you had a concern, I think, or a question about February 1st, but I missed what you're hoping for.
Okay. I'm going to defer to the agency on the date.
Okay.
Because the agency is now tasked with this rulemaking rather than the board. But I did want to highlight that the board right now is tasked with initiating rulemaking on EQS as a result of Act 1. We're about to begin that process. So I think we need to sort of rationalize who's doing what with EQS, because the board is working under a prior directive to initiate rulemaking relative to the studies bill that passed a few years ago as Act 1. And now this is directing the agency to initiate rulemaking with respect to Holocaust studies. Hopefully you could hear that.
Yeah, we are going to move to Mr. Fisher. Mr. Fisher, if you don't mind, I think we have the basic understanding of what Mr. Olson is saying, but I'd like you to pick it up from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Ted Fisher, Vermont Agency of Education, and our Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. And I'm glad to see you again today in a virtual mode this time. I can actually jump right in where Chair Olson left off, because this is an issue that I also wanted to flag with an apology and some requests for clarification on our part. What Chair Olson is talking about is the fact that is in reference to is the fact that the education quality standards are historically a body of rules that the state board tends to. And we yesterday, in our attempt to try to clarify some of the language about who does what, which is also a problem, as you may remember, is happening in the House with different language, we missed a really important thing. So I wanted to first apologize for that lack of clarity there yesterday, and come with slightly different recommendation than what ours was yesterday, which is that this is properly, if this is properly part of the EQS work, our recommendation would be that the state board should do the rulemaking for that. And the reason why is because they are already doing the work that Chair Olson referenced, and this is also their body of rules. Historically speaking, you may in the future direct us to update it, or as part of our agreement with, or our consensus of report with the state board to you about roles and responsibilities, that might change in the future, but they're already going to be opening or potentially opening up the rules when they receive the recommendations of the Act 1 group. So the agency's position has shifted from yesterday, and that was purely due to us not missing, as we were trying to hurriedly sort out the drafting concerns that we had, just missing that it was the education quality standards. The reason for this, just to give you 2 seconds of backstory, is that the House is considering creating a district quality standards as part of 287 in the weighting study, which would be an addition to, let me just make sure I have 16 VSA 165. They would add a subsection to require a district quality standard body of rules, which would be separate and distinct from the education quality standards, and cover things like business and facilities management and governance practice of school districts. And so our work with the House was to have that be an agency-led rulemaking with the board, ensuring that we follow robust public engagement processes. If the state board, so agency's recommendation has shifted entirely due to trying to work fast yesterday, so our apologies for that.
No problem.
We recommend that if the committee would like to amend the EQS, that it remain with the state board. And I want to apologize to Chair Olson, because I was hurriedly trying to draft him an email. We discovered this about an hour ago when we were doing some prep for me to come in to be with you this afternoon, and sort of realized that we'd made an error yesterday. So I apologize, Chair Olson. I was hurriedly sending you an email as we were both trying to join. So if the state board, however, if the committee decides that the state board should do the rulemaking, the language in the section probably can change, because right now it directs the agency to do a public engagement process. The state board routinely has its own engagement process for rulemaking, and so the agency would request not to be directed to do something if the state board is part of it. And that was kind of the language we were reacting to yesterday, was that sort of natural tension. And I had an opportunity to speak to Attorney St. James about that, so I apologize for not having a chance and for having that confusion there. One thing we just wanted to note, and Secretary French asked me to note, he did note this for you yesterday, which is a slightly bigger problem, or slightly bigger question, I guess, which is the question of whether the EQS is the best place for it. Those are standards adopted in rule, but the state board also adopts content standards, which it does not do by rule, and those are the content standards for individual courses of study. So for example, we have civics education content standards already. If memory serves, those are the 3C education standards. I do not know off the top of my head to what extent things like Holocaust studies or other civil rights are incorporated, but I believe that particular set of standards is robust in some of those areas. So it's an open question from our perspective as to whether they should be considered as part of the EQS or whether you should direct the board to adopt a separate set of standards. With that in mind, just because we're not quite sure at this point as to what, and Secretary French was sort of leaning towards the have them do the content standard side. We think a report might actually be the better option if we're making a recommendation to you of which of the options you should choose, is ask us and the board to come back with a report next year and a recommendation for you as to which of the options would be best, because that'll allow us to look at what's in the content standards, look at what's in the EQS. The state board will also have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chair Olson, but at that point, the state board should have received the Act One working groups things and had an opportunity to consider those. So it might be better just if you're looking for a little bit more clarity to come back with the reporting option. So yesterday we were sort of firmly in the rulemaking with a little bit of a misunderstanding. And now we're suggesting that it might be better to have us report to you on what the best option or best set of options would be for covering this next year.
Yeah, Senator Person.
Do you know, Mr. Fisher, or maybe Mr. Olson, if the Act One, the ethics studies, I remember when we passed the bill, we talked about the Holocaust and issues and made sure that, the Jewish people were considered an ethnicity that would be addressed in there. So I didn't know if, Chair Olson said something about they're just starting the rulemaking on Act One or preparing to, but because they're going to get the recommendation from the Act One study committee or whatever it was called. So I wondered if in the Act One rulemaking there would be something about the Holocaust, if anybody knew anything about that.
I can address that. Hopefully you guys can hear me a little better now. So the State Board of Education will actually has on its agenda next week for our meeting on Wednesday next week to hear the formal recommendations of the Act One advisory group. So we're at the very beginning of that process. We'll have those recommendations. I was recently in receipt of a letter and from a number of individuals representing interests of the Jewish community. And it's fair to say that they expressed some concerns about the work of the Act One group some of these issues. So I think to the extent that you're focused on this, it would probably be important to have explicit inclusion of this in your lawmaking.
Yeah. And Chair Olson, do you see a problem with this as far as the timeline of the Act One changes and the dates we have in here for this?
February 1 seems a little aggressive just based on prior experience with rulemaking that we've gone through, where we've had extensive public engagement. So as I mentioned, we're just at the very beginning. We're going to receive the recommendations of the Act One group, and then the board will likely be looking at other opportunities to strengthen the ed quality standards. And we will seek input from a variety of stakeholders as we have in prior rulemaking processes. And that typically takes some time because what we aim to sort of end up with a set of rules that are driven by consensus before they're actually filed with ICAR. So we try to get it right up front before it actually goes up for the formal public comment period. I do think a deadline is important. If we don't have a deadline, these things have a way of dragging on, but February 1st sounds a little aggressive. I would target perhaps more realistically May of next year.
Go ahead, yeah.
And is there a deadline for the Act One changes? Because I wondered if one solution is that we say when you update the standards for Act One, you include these two things that we're mentioning here.
I think that's a great idea.
But if there's no deadline for that, then maybe we do want a deadline.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. So there was there was a deadline for the Act 1 group to report their recommendation to us. But the only requirement for the state board was to consider those recommendations. There was no explicit requirement that we act on them, but there's no firm deadline. So I think it makes sense actually to set a deadline sometime next year. And again, I think May, June next year would be more realistic to accomplish both bodies of work together.
That sounds really smart to me, where people would come back in May with, as Senator Persick mentioned, the Act 1 work. This comes together, making certain that this is supplemental and I think enhances the Act 1 work. Does that make sense, Ms. St. James?
Are we sticking with what's in here, which I do want to provide some clarity on based on some comments?
Okay.
Or are you going with yesterday's option be rulemaking or reporting?
No, I think we're sticking right to this.
Can I come back up and?
Oh, please.
Again, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. So I did want to draw everyone's attention to page 2,
Okay.
section 3. So 16 BSA, so I'm on line 11, 16 BSA 165 is the Education Quality Standards statute.
Yeah.
Those 3 dots, that ellipses, everything that's not here is current law and addresses the education quality standards.
Mm-hmm.
When you were discussing this with AOE a couple days ago, and there was a suggestion to do what was done in 287,
Mm-hmm.
that's what I did. I took the language from 287. And so what you have before you is not actually amending the educational quality standards themselves. It's that concept of creating a school district standard. So that's if I'm hearing AOE correctly today,
Right.
the educational quality standards would be a state board of education rulemaking
Mhm.
responsibility. And if it's the kind of new concept of these school district standards, it would perhaps be the agency of education undergoing that. You may not want to put this in the education or in a new school district concept. You may want to add it right to the education quality standards.
I'm inclined to do that myself. So that just seems like the better path forward for it, to be honest with you.
It's an easy fix, but it just will look differently than this.
Committee,
Sure, unless Ted or
Mr. Fisher?
I just want to say thank you to Attorney St. James for that, because that was a much clearer summation of what I was trying to communicate earlier, which is the concept of a district quality standards is a new concept that we floated in the House last week. But in the agency's perspective, these are similar to what is currently in the EQS. And so therefore we would recommend they be there. And those would be under the purview of the board.
That sounds great.
Got it. And so that would be State Board of Education rulemaking.
Yep.
So instead of AOE,
Mhm.
which is what I just walked through the amendment on,
I know.
it would go back to State Board of Education rulemaking, and we would get rid of the last sentence that talks about prior to the filing of the draft updated rules in section 4 regarding engaging the public. Okay.
well, but we would want the board to do their regular
Engagement.
in number 3.
Yep.
We changed that. That's what I thought they were saying. Is like, in
That
number
would
2 on the top of page 3, these standards shall include a process for school district quality. But I guess we don't do that because it's not a school district quality. So that whole section.
Yes, the language that you have about Holocaust education, global human rights violations, and civics education, I'm just going to plunk up in the ellipses,
Okay.
and you'll see it in context when I'm done with that.
And then we have a deadline.
Of May 2023. Does that
I
work
noted
for
that.
everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then can you mention Act 1?
What would you like me to mention?
When the board has, that's the same deadline for both. The changes to the education quality standards any parts of the recommendation that the board is accepting from the Act One Commission or whatever they're called, and this legislation would be done together by June of 2023.
May of 2023.
May of 2023.
So the rulemaking requirement here is just an initiation of it, of the process, not a
Okay.
completion of the process.
The February deadline, the February.
Yes, so it's on or before they would initiate rulemaking, so that there's enough time for the rulemaking to progress to get to an effective date for your statute change.
What do you consider initiate, like
I think
filing with the Secretary of State, or what processes, or just even like having a public hearing, is that initiating?
I think that would be a great question for
Olson.
AOE or the State Board of Education.
Yeah, I can answer that because we're living that world right now. So initiating rulemaking is, we consider initiating rulemaking when we move it to ICAR.
Okay.
And then when it goes to so basically there's the upfront actual drafting of the rules, and that's where most of the effort takes place. That's where we're engaging with stakeholders. We're writing the rules. We're coming up with a draft that we feel is really good. We send it to ICAR. It then goes into what we call the formal public comment period, where we hold public hearings and things like that, accept formal written comment, make some adjustments, approve the final draft, and then it goes to LCAR. But ideally, before it even goes to ICAR, we want to have a really solid draft that stakeholders have been involved in and everybody's comfortable with before we actually move it to ICAR. That is actually the initiation. So most of the work actually happens before quote unquote initiation.
So we're still sticking with the May 2023.
Well, the work itself would start still in February. I mean, is that where are you concerned that the work shouldn't start in February, Chair Olson?
No, the work can start essentially from whenever you pass this bill, because we're going to be starting the work anyway with the Act One group. What I'm saying is, from our experience, our most recent experience, it takes many months working with a variety of stakeholders to come to a consensus draft. And keep in mind, the board is essentially a group of volunteers who meet monthly with some committee meetings. So we're not, working 40 hours a week on these things.
Yeah. So for my clarification, Ms. St. James, this February 1 date, it sounds like, so are you looking for that date to change, Oliver?
Yes.
You are?
To May.
To
Yes.
May. Okay.
Because
So that's when they have to initiate rulemaking by that date. Okay.
correct.
Kind of like that,
So
the
that
final
would be-
draft.
Yep.
That would be when it was sent to ICAR.
Correct.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that goes on.
Yeah.
And then you figure 3 months of public comment, a few months to respond to public comment, and then it goes to LCAR.
Hey, and then you get to read it.
How's that feel?
Great.
Okay. So we have one more witness, and then we'll be done with this. Is Mr. Bannon in the hall? Thanks, Dan.
Does the committee need anything else from me?
No, I don't think so. Guys,
Okay.
mind if we just take a quick 2 minutes? All right, well, is that okay? Yeah.
Good, perfect timing. Oh, by the way.
You one of these.
Yeah, we're immunity is. Or the
Feel much better
or the
after
whole,
that.
any